Jeanette is going to be talking about fixing ghosts, witnessing disappearing spaces along the North Norfolk coast. I have a wonderful biography that you can all see, but I'm going to read it out loud. Jeanette Bolton-Martin is a photographer and researcher based in Norwich, UK. Her work explores coastal erosion through photographic practice ranging from digital moving image to analog processes to investigate ways of representing vanishing land and its effect on those who bear witness to it. She is currently undertaking her PhD by practice at Norwich University of the Arts and UAL, alongside lecturing and freelance projects. So this is a especially important for me because Jeanette, I'm one of her supervisors. So doctoral pursuit. So she's a wonderful photographer, and the most important thing is that she's working. She's going to tell us all about it. But she's working in an area where she grew up and she knows very, very well.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I would like to thank Dr. Marina Velez-Vargo and Dr. Veronica Sakoulas for the invitation to speak today. Unfortunately, I was meant to be presenting this in person, but due to some unforeseen health issues, I'm now having to present online. But it is wonderful to be included as part of this program, and I will be sharing a paper that I'm currently working on that explores my methodology and my practice as a photographer working with coastal erosion. And it's especially valuable in times like these to have these spaces for dialogues. So without further ado, I will get into my presentation. Around the time I was applying for my PhD, a book came out called The Easternmost House by Juliet Blaxland. This book was published in April 2019, precisely a month before I sent in my application to start my research. This particular book, I didn't pay much attention to at the time, but as time has gone on, this has become quite an influential text in how I approach my work. The Easternmost House is part memoir, part history of a house in Eastern Bavant in Suffolk. And it's called the Easternmost House because this house was one of the last remaining of a village along the side of a cliff. Although this was published in 2019, by February 2020, the Easternmost House had been demolished. The only portrait of this house, of this space that exists now, is this book. And this fusion between experience, history, and documentation has become something that's quite prominent with my own work. See, I am a photographer. I am also a lifelong Norfolk resident. I grew up in a family who ran a coastal hotel. Our hotel was literally on a cliff face. So for us, there was always an implicit understanding that landscape was not necessarily stable. All it would take is one storm, and everything that we had built, everything we had worked for would be washed into the sea. And the process of erosion is so ongoing, so omnipresent, especially in the area I live. It is simply part of the background. It's something that you just simply acknowledge, and you understand that the land beneath your feet is not stable. And this particular revelation is something that's always felt quite natural to me, but for many people who don't live in landscapes such as this, the idea of landscape not being stable, but the land beneath your feet not being able to hold your foundations of your homes and your lives is quite alien. And to be completely honest, despite the fact that I've been a Norfolk resident, I've grown up with this, coastal erosion didn't particularly make its presence known in my practice until I was doing my master's. I began working on a process of documenting spaces such as Haysborough, which is a site of very rapid coastal erosion. It's very well known. It's like Winterton and Hemsby, known for always disappearing. But I found that I was having issues, particularly when I began my PhD, because I returned to this documentary style of working. Now, in my initial practice, this had worked really well. This had been almost a simple exercise, photographing spaces, then going back and photographing what was lost. But there was something that I felt was missing in the work, and I couldn't really put my finger on what. So I began to experiment with different forms of image making. I would work with distortion, work with creating different translations of these spaces, maybe not straight documentation. And although visually the work began to go somewhere, there was a deep frustration because there felt a great disconnect between what I was experiencing in these spaces to what I was actually able to produce. Now, there's often this idea of a hierarchy of knowledge, that in order for something to be valid, it must come across as objective and universal, some kind of innate truth. And while I began writing about my practice, I fell into this trap quite often. I would make statements about our experience of place, our experience of these landscapes, when in fact, what I was talking about was specifically my experience of these spaces, my experience of these landscapes. But it took me a very long time to become comfortable with the idea of being a witness to these spaces, and that my knowledge, my understanding coming from a landscape that is always shifting would be valid, would be a good enough contribution to knowledge to be worth sharing. Within my work, I often work around the idea of eroding coastal spaces as places where we encounter the non-human. Within my practice, I define this as encounters with that which is not me. So this works from entanglements with landscape and space to creatures to plants. They have always been spaces due to their shift and their flux, where these entanglements and relationships seem to make themselves known, with various different outcomes. Sometimes it can feel peaceful, sometimes it feels utterly terrifying, but it's a reminder that we are a smaller part of a bigger whole. We are not separate from the lands we inhabit. We are as much part of them as the plants that grow on the cliffs. And this was something that was innately coming out in my work, but to a certain extent, I refused to acknowledge it. I felt for this work to be valid, for it to be contributing something. I still had to take the position of outside observer, which, as I've gone on, makes no sense. My work is deeply autoethnographic. I am working from translating my experiences of these spaces, using my practice to make sense of what I am feeling and what I am seeing. And to a certain extent, this process of simply documenting broken cliffs, documenting broken houses, didn't get to the core of my experience of these spaces. There's far more to it than that. Some of it is fearful, but some of it is also somewhat affirming. So by realizing that actually the simple documentation of erosion was not the process that I was attempting to get across, my practice shifted. It became something more than simply documenting the space as it was, but interpreting the space through my own lens. And so these elements began to shift into something more meditative. When I worked, I began to think less about perfect compositions and how much of the cliff I need to show, and instead focusing on the smaller details that speak to me while I experience these spaces. And through this letting go of the idea that I must be an objective and neutral observer, the work became more interesting, and to a certain extent, it became more true to my own experiences. And this project began to lean into the idea that understanding things can be based in imagination. It can be based through this process of creativity and translation. And so something began to shift. As I began to work through these spaces, it was no longer looking for technically correct images. It was no longer looking for perfect documentations, but using the elements of the spaces, playing with the light, playing with the shadow to begin to paint a portrait of an experience in these sites, something that went beyond the conventional idea of loss and sadness, but began to think about more how I fit into this landscape as a person. And then it began to struck me that although there's this idea that knowledge must be completely impartial, it must be objective, that's not really reality. My perspective is my perspective. It is not a universal. I cannot speak to anybody else's experience of these spaces, but I can speak to my own. And by sharing my own experiences and my own perspectives of these spaces, the narratives that seem to come to me while I am here, I can contribute to that wider web of human knowledge. It may not be perfectly scientific. I understand these sort of coastal processes that go on, but this project isn't about the actual nitty-gritty of how coastal erosion works. This project is more about representing this shift and how it feels to always be present in it. And so, as I began to be more comfortable with this, I began to change the way I worked. Now, the space has always shaped my practice. There's always been a very definite way I work. I am not someone who spends really long periods of time sitting and looking, working with heavy equipment. Due to the instability of these spaces, you have to always be aware of your surroundings. You must always be listening, you must always be looking, always aware of how the weather conditions can affect the cliffs, because although people don't always take the sandy cliff falling as particularly serious, this can kill people. There's been many incidents of people caught in cliff falls. And so you do know that these landscapes, although familiar, although almost home for me, are still perilous. There is a danger in inhabiting them. So this has always informed my practice. I work very quickly. I work and I walk quickly. I don't go out when I know the weather conditions aren't suitable, when I know cliff falls are likely to happen due to the danger that this presents, not only to me, but to anybody else who might have to come to my aid. So this has always been something in the back of my mind of how I work. And when I was beginning to try and make more documentary style work, where I was having to spend more time in the landscape, problems began to arise. That innate fear, not only for my safety, but of the understanding of the shifting space, began to come into play. And so instead of fighting this process and fighting this innate instinctive way of making, I began to embrace it. And as I began to embrace it, the practice began to evolve. And what particularly I noticed was when I was experiencing these spaces, when I was focusing on what details that I was drawn to, it wasn't necessarily large vistas or large landscapes. What particularly came to mind, the things that I noticed were the smaller details. There were small rusting bits of coastal defences, little cracks in cliffs, tiny things that felt so important and that often felt overlooked. This particular piece and the following piece is coming from a series called Fragmented Narratives. And through this process of documentation and narration, I began to realise as I experienced these spaces, certain ideas came to mind. This is when the ideas of encounter with otherness began to manifest in my practice in a very tangible way. This fusion of image and text, although not a direct translation and not particularly linear, none of these narrations are linear, began to come together to start to present a picture that made more sense from my own experience of these spaces. It was no longer trying to take on the eye of neutral observer. It was taking on the eye of resident, of witness, of storyteller. And this process of storytelling has become key to my practice. Looking back at works like the Easternmost House and even the work of writers like Robert Macfarlane, these works aren't situated in cold hard facts. They're not situated on, say, the exact geographical makeup of a landscape. What they're situated on is the experience and translation of those spaces into literature. And my practice has begun to shift not from the straight documentation of the photographs of cliff spaces, but instead translations of my experiences of these spaces. And there is a power in beginning to understand that actually this experience is not universal and it does not need to be. What I see, what I feel when I work amongst these spaces changes from time to time. It's influenced by so many other things, but it allows a sense of story, a sense of connection that ultimately I was never able to achieve before. And this has actually breached into my understanding of my practice as a whole, and this understanding of entanglements with the non-human, with that which is not me, the other right around us. And to a certain extent, it can be quite scary to suddenly realize how small you are, but also a great comfort and peace comes from the realization that you are part of a greater whole. These narrations, these stories, like the documents and the portrait of the Easternmost House, are simply ephemera, traces of something that will be lost. But potentially that loss shouldn't be greeted with sadness. Now, I can never underestimate the fear and the terror that goes into living in a coastal area, the realization that you could lose everything so very easily. And I'm not trying to underplay that. I'm not trying to downplay that in my work. That is a real human tragedy, feeling the waves beat upon a cliff as your house vibrates with the sound. That is pure terror. There is nothing that will make that not scary. But there is more than fear in these spaces. It is a reminder of our space and our entanglements with others, and that actually even the landscape will fade, even the landscape will change. Coastal spaces, especially eroding ones, are particularly interesting. They're dynamic by nature. They're always moving, always shifting, always changing. They don't remain the same. And that is very much our experience of life as well, the experience of other animals, and the realization that this process is quite universal. It's a very different timescale, but there is a universality here that makes you feel more at one with the spaces you inhabit, understanding their mortality as much as yours. And through this process, this is where the realization that a detached perspective is not necessarily the most useful one, because it is not characteristic of all our endeavors. It's a key part of our understanding, is that subjectivity, that experience of our own spaces. So as I've been working, this idea of flux, this idea of shift and change, again, is coming through in my work. I've recently begun to work with moving image particularly, and working with subtle distortions and variations. So for the last piece of this presentation, I will leave you with a recent work called Coastal Glitch. That is the end of my presentation. I would like to thank everybody for their time. If you have any questions about my work, I will still be around at least until lunchtime, but thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Wonderful presentation, and a powerful reminder of the things that are not permanent, and how one needs to adjust and go with it. And I'm sure everybody here present and online can relate to your story, your practice, your beautiful work, documenting and bearing witness to a changing landscape. We also invite the presenters to pose some questions for the audience, and we are going to gather those questions during the lunchtime, and then we will work with them in our dialogues and our conversations.